Studying here.
I study sociology.
You're
I'm the second year
PhD
in sociology. I went to your seminar 3 times, so it's very enlightening because trade has always been my blind spot.
You have the large one, I see.
Yeah.
I have just the same one, I always wondered how heavy this is.
Yeah, this is a little bit heavier.
A little heavy.
There's a new iPad coming out. Might be a little thinner.
But
it's all assembled probably in Chengdu. I mean,
right.
Chengdu has one of the largest assembly line.
For Foxconn?
Yeah, Foxconn and iPad.
Right.
Yeah, I don't know if it's for iPhone.
I
iPad
toured the Ford factory in Chengdu, but I couldn't get into Foxconn. They wouldn't let me in.
Yeah, it's confidential. So I brought some questions,
and of course.
Primarily on TPP and trade. First of all, I got a question about Trump. And you wrote an op-ed in New York Times in February urging Trump to support Axiom Bank as a low-hanging fruit to create jobs. So what has been the reception of Axiom Bank by Donald Trump's administration?
Well, today they had a hearing. The way it works, I don't know how well you know American governmental system, but the chairman, which I was, and the 4 other board members require approval by the U.S. Senate. So the president appoints, but the Senate has to confirm them. And so today there was a hearing for all 5, because there are 5 vacancies. And we'll see how that goes. I obviously don't know what the outcome is yet. So I'm happy that President Trump moved forward, named a board, named a board, and now it's up to the U.S. Senate to decide about whether they confirm them or not. Of the 5, the chairman and the 4 others, the chairman is a very, very controversial figure because he, for many, many years, led the charge to close the bank forever.
Oh, really?
So
it's been there like 83 years, right?
Right. So people go, wait, all you do is vote to close the bank. Why do you not want to run it? Do we really trust you? So we'll see what happens.
So that chairman is picked by Trump or?
Trump.
Okay.
He picks the chairman.
Not good news.
The president chooses the whole board and a job called the Inspector General, which is sort of it's like an outside auditor. To look at what's going on at the bank.
Yeah, it's interesting because Trump made lots of arguments against TPP. And one quote I found, it's TPP is a horrible deal. It's a deal designed for China to come in, as they always do, through the back door and totally take advantage of everyone. So Trump has this interesting way of making reversal of logic. And another tweet I can remember is climate change is a hoax perpetrated by China to make American manufacturing non-competitive. So this pattern has been going on and on. And there are also other arguments, but most of them are poked by media, like Chinese manipulation of currency and trade deficit with China. This might be more complex, but when it comes to as complex an issue as trade, it's not always easy to determine who is winning.
Well, and the complexity even about the trade deficit with China is, I'm surprised China hasn't said this. Well, one of the reasons there's a trade deficit is we have American companies making things in China and selling them to America. So yell at your companies. What are you yelling at? It's Apple and Nike and everybody else who's makes things in China. Christmas ornaments, everything else. So, I think Donald Trump, to be political for a minute, because I can do whatever I want since I'm not on the faculty. I think anything President Obama liked, he doesn't like.
Yeah. I think part of the problem with Trump is he is very anti-Obama than whatever crusade he is trying to do, and he's trying to distance himself from Obama, probably because of Tea Party movement, making Obama a prime target for whatever issue they're trying to attack. But let's talk a little bit about farmer in the United States. The poll shows that 70% of farmers, or people who do farming, support Trump. But there are lots of media talking about it will be a big win for farmer if TPP is passed. People say it might be United States can export lots of agricultural products to Japan.
Right.
Do these farmers buy this argument? What is going on in the mind?
That's a good question, Yang, and that is one of the big exports we have in this country is agriculture.
Yeah.
And both the NAFTA and if we had TPP, it would benefit farmers around the country.
Yeah.
But I think, and there was a book many years ago called What's the Matter with Kansas? Sometimes people vote their heart, their values, versus their wallet. So people may feel comfortable with Donald Trump's language, even though that may be not good for their business. So I think you find that with a lot of farmers, they tend to be more traditional, more conservative.
Yeah, I heard an interview by Fareed with Hillary Clinton talking about she didn't make an economic argument, but Hillary said it's more about cultural issue than economic issue. This is one example because farmers stand to benefit from export, but they support Donald Trump by 70%.
Right.
This comes to my next question. So yesterday, you talked about there was no natural coalition for trade. You also mentioned in your op-ed that Tea Party mobilized against Exim Bank.
Right.
Can you talk a little bit the history? In 2016, this has been highly politicized, but long before that, there was Tea Party.
Right. Well, the Tea Party really got started around 2011.
Yeah.
So for many years, pre-Tea Party, we were loved by the Exim was loved by the Republicans, and Democrats had some issues with it. The Tea Party, and if you want, there's a great article in Politico about John Boehner, the former speaker. The Tea Party has gotten so ultra-conservative and so unreasonable that anything that, I tried to bring this up a little bit yesterday, anything that the government's engaged, they feel the government can do nothing right. So if this is a government-sponsored or backed loan, it must be bad on the surface. Because the private sector does everything perfectly, and the government does everything terribly. It's a really I used to think of them as, they're not Republicans, they're anarchists. They just don't believe in government. So, and I think the Tea Party wanted to prove that they're serious, they mean business, they're going to dismantle government, and because Exim was a sunset agency, we talked a little bit about that, because every, could be 3 years, 5 years, 6 years, the authority to make new loans sunsets or ends, Congress has to affirmatively do something to make it continue. Congress is very good at doing nothing. We've seen all year where they confirmed Neil Gorsuch. That's about the only, and named some post offices.
Yeah. And trade is also a business of Congress. I mean, primarily than the president.
Well, certainly trade agreements require Congress to be engaged. So I think, oddly, and I think and I'm not the biggest expert on this, but we're seeing a whole realignment of political parties. Democratic Party tends to be more and more urban, more young, more college educated, minorities, and Republican Party is increasingly more traditional, and Labor is somewhat, blue collar workers are somewhat in the middle of all that.
Yeah.
Because traditionally they've been the heart of the Democratic Party. But the values, like we talked about with farmers, often are more aligned with the Republican Party. And I think that's made that fissure, that break. So they are less reliable as Democratic voters than they used to be.
So one thing I found interesting is, what if Hillary Clinton had made more affirmative case for global trade instead of pulling out from her argument after
TPP.
Bernie Sanders and Donald Trump slammed TPP. Because part of the problem with Hillary is authenticity problem. And if she made affirmative case for trade, I don't think it would hurt her a lot. Probably he would be a voice for more inclusive globalism. And this idea is not actually told by any politician in the United States. It's told by Ma Yun, the chairman of Alibaba in Davos. He talked about inclusive globalism, and several hundred years ago, global trade was controlled by several emperors, and a few decades ago by several 100,000 large companies. What if in the near future we create 6 million small businesses and globalism become more inclusive? So it's like a beautiful dream, but at least someone is trying to peddle this image. But in the United States, I mean, what is so hard for a politician to make affirmative case for global trade?
I think the problem is we have had flat wages for like 20 years. People have not seen an increase in the standard of living. I don't think correctly, but wrongly, trade gets blamed. And until we can find a way that we're going to increase people's standard of living, it's going to be really hard to be pro-trade. Because trade is seen as the culprit, as the force that's actually pushed down wages. And, you know, it's not clear, but, you know, what we have like almost zero inflation right now. And you go like, how's that possible? Well, products and services are made all over the globe. And because of that, it's actually kept prices down, I think.
Yeah.
There's less, you know, in the old days, if you lived in the United States, you lived in France, and it was more contained market, and if they wanted to raise prices, they could raise prices, and then maybe there were tariffs to keep out products, so that there was more built-in inflation. Well, now, more goods move around the world. Tariffs in many countries aren't that high, and so that's put a bit of a damper on price increases. So there's less inflation. So that should also make workers feel better that the standard of living. But products are really come down, but what has not come down and gone up is healthcare, education. Chicago's a good example. And to some extent housing. So although groceries, clothing, cars, gas, you know, all that has really come down. But the things that are the big ticket items that people also worry about, how do I, you know, what happens if I get sick? Where do my kids go to school? What's it cost to buy a new house? Those have all had much sharper price increases. That makes people uncomfortable.
Part of the reason is Americans are not fatalist. They always try to find someone or something to blame. But the problem is all these things about wage stagnation is a social process, and people tend to pick specific arena like trade or technology or automation or something like that, but they are hand in glove. They are all interrelated, and there are lots of problems in terms of duality problem, time horizon problem, and if we analyze them, it's so hard even for experts to tease out the factors. But people tend to believe in a personified trade, you know, because trade is easier to blame than others.
It's the outsider.
So what has been that part of education to Americans, you know, to educate people about global trade deals and their impact on the economy, so they wouldn't make terrible decision on that. At least they know the world is complicated. What has been that part of education? Zero.
Terrible. We just don't spend the money and the time to do it. Partly I blame companies. I think they could do a better job explaining to their workers, you know, at the Boeing company, like 80% of what they make is exported. How would making sure our employees understand that?
So it's up to companies, not the school.
I think it's up to everybody, but I think companies have a direct impact on the anti-trade sentiment that hurts them directly. So that's the reason I say companies should get in the game.
For example, in the United States, you have a terrible deficit in coffee. I heard the number is like $6 billion.
Of coffee.
But this is a good example to show to people trade is not black or white, either or argument.
Right.
It's very complicated. And you have Starbucks going to China, and you have the best Starbucks outlet in China. For example, in Chengdu, in Taiguli, it's a very famous commercial area. The Starbucks has 3 stories, and the CEO of Starbucks came there and, sold the books.
Uh-huh.
I mean, the best Starbucks outlet probably are in China.
Right.
I mean, lots of them are so beautiful and so high end. Yeah, I think part of the problem is education, but interesting
and listen, schools should do a better job. I'm actually taking a course at the business school on international commercial policy about trade. Doug Irwin teaches it. It's a great course. Talking about the politics and the policy around trade, exports, imports, jobs, investment. It's good.
Cool. So I wanted you to talk a little bit about China. In the fall of 2015, President Xi declared that Beijing would implement supply-side structural reform, something used by Reagan, to cut debt and overcapacity in Chinese economy. And we see this year lots of big companies, even the richest man in China was kind of punished probably by Xi himself and all the other state-owned media. About the debt problem Chinese company face today. The debt has climbed up to probably over 250% of Chinese GDP. But still, lots of people are talking about the potential threat, from the United States or other countries, about One Belt, One Road strategy.
Right.
But how could China balance its effort to confront its debt overhang and its effort to pursue One Belt, One Road strategy, to build land and sea trade routes spanning 60 countries without bankrupting itself? So how could the world understand Chinese strategy better? Expansion of Chinese leadership. Yeah.
First of all, Chinese foreign reserves, that means how much foreign currency they have in China. We can look it up. Why don't you let's see what it is. Let's see what it says for Chinese foreign exchange.
Yeah, it's going down a little bit.
It's gone down a little bit. But they've got a huge amount of cash.
Yeah.
So I'm not so worried that they can't afford it. And China is interested in One Belt, One Road in terms of sphere of influence, selling products and exports, financing it. And I think that they've got a lot of people they got to keep working. So it's worth their while to keep pushing product out. And they have this thing called China 2025, which is about really being more self-reliant. So making their own airplanes, high-speed rail, satellites, computers. And that's also, a risk to the rest of the world. It's better when China is both successful, but actively trading. But if China won't be successful, we're just going to make everything ourselves. And China, I think, are your parents born here or in China?
In China.
In Chengdu, obviously, yeah.
In Hunan.
Hunan. And do they still live there?
Yeah. So they are still working.
So, I think one of the challenges is, China has felt for a long time that, the last 100, 200 years have been unfair to China. That its place in the world has, they're trying to regain their place in the world. You probably see this as a Chinese citizen.
Yeah, so Western media would say it's manipulating victimization mentality. But I can also find some parallel in the United States, like
of course.
African Americans talking about victimization by the whites. So there are lots of similar cases, not only in China but also in the United States. But I see the tragedy is Trump is making all this reversal of logic, and it messes up everything, and it actually plays in the hand of Chinese government. For example, TPP is actually something that contains China, at least in the short term.
That would contain China.
Contain.
Contain them, yes.
Yeah, that's for sure.
Yep.
People would say, okay, in the long term, China would up its game, so it's better for China to reform economically. But at least in the short term, it's a way to contain China. But after Trump's withdrawal from TPP, it creates so many openings for China to take the lead.
Totally.
Yeah. Probably you can argue that for the short term, China can take the lead, but for the long term, it will slow its reform efforts.
Right.
Subsidizing, SOE in China.
Right.
There's no pressure for China to up its game in terms of labor, in terms of environment. But China is doing great in investing clean energy, probably twice as much as U.S. investment.
Of course.
So this is a mixed.
It's very mixed. Unfortunately, and people would like it to be like simplistic, and it's not. It's much more complicated. They certainly lead in solar power. Mm-hmm. We really haven't kept up with that. Mm-hmm. And they put a lot of government money into that solar power. Mm-hmm. But we could have done that too. We chose not to.
So I want to talk about South China Sea, because thinking about what TPP would have done to this issue, many people say this is more like using trade rather than gunship to solve this tension. So what could have been the effect of TPP on U.S. role in South China Sea? What if TPP was installed?
Well, I'm not enough of an expert on all of that, but I think that TPP would have better anchored the U.S. in Asia the way we've been anchored in Europe and the Atlantic since World War II. So I think that would have just increased the presence of U.S. interest, commercial interest, and just presence in the region that TPP would have enhanced. So without that, and there are many countries in the South China Sea that are very nervous about China. Because they see China as a big player, military might, and maybe not always playing fair. So I think that, if you talk to American military people, they thought TPP was very important. It's not a military thing, but they thought that would be important for us in Asia if we had TPP.
Yeah, the thing I worry about is, without TPP, if U.S. want to leverage in this issue, they will use more military confrontation than trade, and that could be a flashpoint.
Right.
Even
and
more.
Certainly, our president at the time certainly has that mindset. So I'm curious if I can ask you, how hard was it for you as a Chinese national to be able to leave China to study here? Is that hard to do? Not hard to do?
Well, there are probably 300,000 Chinese overseas students in the United States. That's a big part of the diplomacy,
Right.
That's a good thing.
Yes.
And lots of parents are eager to send the kids to the United States, even though there are lots of problems, like gun issue. My father was horrified. My grandmother was even more horrified by Las Vegas gun issue.
Right. That doesn't happen in China.
Yeah, you can walk
anywhere else.
Yeah, you can walk freely outside
Right.
your home. Even you may worry about people pickpocket you in the middle of the night, but not worrying about someone shoot you, ambush you in the dark. Parents are having this arms race, investing in the kids, and they think that it's a good strategy to send the kids to the United States.
Yes.
Now there are more junior high school students coming from China. Decades ago, it was graduate students coming to the United States.
Your parents must be well off if they can send you to school.
Actually, I spent 3 years working on my own, and
Here or in China?
In China. I earned enough money to pay for my master in here. I spent a lot of money here. But then I was lucky, and I got the offer from PhD program. So that means I am financed by the university. But I think there's a drive in China, but also lots of people tend to go back to China after they finish education
Is that what you're
in the United States. I don't know. I study sociology. There's no market job market in sociology.
No, in China.
Probably in China. There are lots of...
There'd be a bigger market in China than here?
There are expansion of higher education in China.
Right.
So many departments have sociology branch, and they are eager to hire people who have PhD degree in the United States. But I'm not sure. I have lots of interest.
And you got time.
Even for trade, such a blind spot for me, I still want to know something about it.
Right.
So how do you find China?
My first trip to China was in 1981. Probably before you were born.
Yeah. 7 years before I was born. Yeah.
So I went to the Guangzhou Fair. I think it was still called Canton in those days. So I went 81, 91, and then I've gone probably, I don't know, 7 or 8 times, 10 times. That's why when I tell people, where have you been? I say, well, I've been to Shenzhen, I've been to Shenzhen. I list all this. You've been to more places than I have.
Did you feel the work ethic in China different?
Oh, very, very strong.
I mean, they work overtime. When it was time to shut down the store, they would still work a little bit while.
Absolutely.
I mean, work-life balance is much fuzzier in China.
Here.
I found it most obvious in a barbershop. Here in the United States, you go into a barbershop, you are not treated as a customer. You should force smile to the barber, and barber sometimes would treat you be grouchy. And but in China, it's
You have to get your new barber then.
Yeah,
there are good barbershops here.
Yeah, I believe so. But if you just spend like $20 or $25 for your haircut, you won't get very nice treatment. But in China, it's a growth industry, and you are treated like you got everything prepared for you. It's like going to a hotel.
Your English is very good. You all learned it in China or here?
I learned it in China since my 5th grade.
Right. That's when you have to learn when you're young.
Yeah, but now English education started quite early. It's in kindergarten. They will have some sort of English education. So do you think Trump has more autonomy than the previous politicians? Because he is a self-funded billionaire, but he seems to be in favor of politicizing lots of issues. I mean, sometimes to the eyes of experts, it's not in the interest of the United States. So what is happening to him? I mean, he has lots of people who can provide expertise to him, and he got people briefing him. I mean, he would be in the circle of experts telling him the right thing to do. So to what extent is Donald Trump taking hostage to political games at home in terms of, all this international
he's taking
policy?
Hostage?
To what extent is he taken hostage by all these political games? I mean, sometimes from his base, sometimes from Tea Party, sometimes from his aides.
Well, I think, if I can understand your question there, I think what he's really doing is keeps solidifying his base, keeps doing things they would like. And by doing so, he is strengthening he's making sure that they never, let's assume he runs again in 2020. He wants to make sure his base will never think about going to another Republican. So I think he keeps feeding them more and more stuff that he knows they'll like, so that he's got that. And then he'll worry about the general election later. But he wants to make sure that some other Republican doesn't try and run a primary against him. Is that clear?
Yeah.
And try and challenge him. I think he's going to get challenged, if I had to guess.
But the policy outcome wouldn't be that fast. So he has the time horizon to just focus on catering to his base rather than the policy outcome. Right now the economy is good. That's something he always brag about. But it's hard to tease out his effort and his policy effect on the economy.
Right.
Probably he's very confident that the detriment part of his policy wouldn't come out after 4 years of his administration.
You're absolutely right. I mean, listen, even the Paris Climate Agreement, we actually...
4 years.
Yeah, it's on election day. The day before election day is when it actually triggers.
Yeah, that's interesting.
And if you lose it,
how come that it was like the next day of the election day? How come that the withdrawal date
I think
is
it was
like
just
when
the way the calendar worked. You know,
really? Wow.
Because it's the same for every country. If you want to withdraw, there's a certain time period. So it happened to coincide with our election, but if India withdrew, it might not be, that's not their election cycle.
Yeah.
A lot of countries are on a 5-year cycle, like China.
Yeah.
I've never understood how the United States got on 4-year because, 5 and 5 is 10. We tend to be in a decimal system. Yeah. But how we've ever came up with 4 and 6 is a little peculiar to me.
Yeah. So how do you find Xi Jinping? There are lots of criticism from Western media, but actually lots of his decision is really strategic from the long-term perspective. His pick of standing committee in the Politburo was speculated by lots of media, but turns out it's a balancing act. He consolidated his power, but he didn't let Wang Qishan, the anti-corruption czar, to stay on. It signaled to people that he might not hold on to power after 5 years.
Right.
But people would also argue that, he didn't pick his successor. He will also hold on to power. But all this media logic feels some suspicion from Chinese reader. I mean, Chinese reader are also following Western media, and they see that Western media is making retreat because they make some bold prediction, and all this prediction poked by the reality. Right. Lots of Chinese liberals pin their hope on America as being good and powerful, but right now they find little case to make about the liberal pursuit in China because Donald Trump is definitely not someone who can provide moral authority.
Oh, I think that's I think you're absolutely right, Yang. I think that's a real problem, and that is we were an example, and set an example for openness, debate, liberal thinking, the rule of democracy globally, and we've retreated from that. Because you're right, some of the criticisms of Xi Jinping is that it seems more authoritarian, less open-minded, less flourishing of different ideas and so forth.
The party chief in charge of ideology now used to be a professor, and he actually helped 3 succession of leadership to frame their ideology, 3 Represent by Jiang Zemin, Chinese Dream by Xi Jinping, and Scientific Development by Hu Jintao. Neo-authoritarianism is something he contributed, and now he's the chief of that part of DAF. Chinese never liked the idea of authoritarianism, but when this party chief had this power after 19th Congress, lots of people feel good about it, especially in the backdrop of Trump's more authoritarian tendency. So I think
that's a very good insight because Trump's authority sort of encourages it elsewhere.
He's putting a bad face on democracy, but in China, that party chief is putting good face for authoritarianism.
Right.
All this stuff contributes to the bad image of democracy. I think it jibes with Trump's way of making all this logical reversal, and it messes up everything.
Right. I think that's a very keen insight. That's why I wrote it down.
In the larger context, Trump's more authoritarian.
Encourages it elsewhere.
Yeah. In China, you can put good face on authoritarianism. That professor is so smart, so intellectual. He doesn't like to speak a lot. So he had a very good record on his academic pursuit. He invented all these ideologies in the recent decades. So it's interesting to see what's going to play out.
I agree.
All right.
So how many more years do you have?
It's going to take a long time. PhD is like 7 years at least in Chicago. All right. Nice talking with you.
Nice talking to you too. Thank you. Thanks for coming.
Thank you so much. Take care. It's getting colder.
I know.